Someone left me treats up here. That's awesome. Good morning, West Portal. We have been walking and will continue to walk through Jesus' well-known Sermon on the Mount, which gives us a picture of the kind of transformation that starts to take place in lives when Jesus gets a hold of our heart. Now, we've been transitioning, and last Sunday was kind of part of that hinge from what are called Beatitudes, kingdom character traits that run countercultural, right? Blessed are the poor in spirit, the gentle, the merciful, and so on. We've been transitioning from Beatitudes, kingdom character traits, to what we've affectionately called Do-attitudes, kingdom behavior. Jesus gives us a series of very short snapshots, or like today it would be like YouTube video clips, but about what it looks like when people live this out, as James was saying, when people turn around and trust their life weight to this good news. And he uses very practical situations and settings to illustrate this. We were reminding ourselves of this over the past 2 weeks, and the quick reminder is in order. Jesus has not come to abolish the law or the prophets. Jesus is not doing away with God's law and heading in his own or in a new direction. Jesus has come to fulfill it, quite literally to fill it full. We said, and so what happens is there's a difference between the letter of the law and the spirit of the law. As I was prepping this week, I found myself doing this just symbolically as part of my prep. So if I do that and you weren't here last Sunday, we just used the example of squabbling kids in the back seat and the parents' rule that says don't touch, right? And that temptation to go like this a millimeter away. This is observing the letter of the law, but the spirit behind the law goes much deeper. And we understand this, even just on kind of our own human level. Jesus makes exactly the same kind of point with God's law. And so last Sunday we were looking at the law, the sixth commandment that Jesus has a bit of a commentary on. Do not murder. And we all feel really good about not having committed homicide, right? Like, excellent, I'm living up to this. And Jesus says, well, I mean, good for you, that's part of the arc. But if we fill this full, this is going to include public insult, biting, sarcastic remarks. In fact, Jesus is going to go right to the heart issue and say, even that which is not externally obvious, that nursing and nurturing of bitterness and resentment is part of this broad arc. It's part of God's heartbeat for healthy, flourishing, vibrant relationships, and harboring that is actually displeasing to God, and it's damaging to relationships. Now, I want to give just a very brief epilogue to last Sunday because a number of you came and talked to me asking and kind of questions about specific relationships that you're like, I don't know how to experience reconciliation with. And I can impossibly give you advice for everything. But so 2 very brief comments. Can you give me the first one? Jesus gives a very simple example in these do-attitudes. I just want to say, but a simple example does not mean a simplistic application. Okay, I get it. Relationships are complicated, and especially if there's grievance, if there's hurt, if there's conflict. You are going to have to the best of your ability, wrestle to just discern what you need to do and what you need to let go of. And for the sake of time, I can't make that point perhaps more eloquently than that. If I was going to give you just one verse that captures this principle, in my opinion, Paul writes the following in Romans chapter 12. He says, if it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. And this implies 2 things. One is that it may not always be possible. The reality with reconciled relationships is you need both parties often to make things right. And if one is willing and the other is not, you can forgive, but you may or may not be reconciled. And the other piece just says, the only thing that you and I have direct control over is our part in it. And so that's the piece that always we can wrestle with. Is there something still that I need to do or take steps towards? And so I leave that with you not because it feels good, but it's the reality that says even with our best Jesus-following intentions, you and I may sometimes have to also find a degree of peace with relationships that still carry aspects of brokenness with them. And I wish I had better news for you than that, but that's a human reality that we will have to simply live with. Now, for the sake of time this morning, I'm going to jump pretty quickly into our passage, and we said this last Sunday as well. I referenced Proverbs 4:23. Guard your heart because it's the wellspring of life. What you and I nurse and nurture in our hearts often comes up. It bubbles up through what we say. It spills over in what we do as just a prelude, perhaps nowhere is this more true than the passage we come to this morning as well. And so Matthew chapter 5 is where we are. I'm picking up at verse 27. Simple does not mean simplistic, and we have some colorful conversation that we will get to this morning. By the way, just a little apology this morning. If you're a first-time visitor to West Portal, yeah, people are laughing because I put a little video clip out for Friday just as a disclaimer. It's like, we're coming to a passage about lustful thoughts. And I can't preach about this without addressing some really candid topics. And so we're going to talk about pornography. We're going to talk about masturbation. If you are a first-time visitor, either you're going to think we're the best church ever, or you're never coming back, and we have an I Survived Sex Sunday at West Portal t-shirt for you on your way out, all right? These are the issues that we wrestle with. They're the questions that we're asking. So this is partly where we're going this morning. And by the way, every handshake I got this morning was, "Are you okay? We've been praying for you this morning." So thank you for your prayers. It'll be good. It's good conversation. So let's read this, and we will have just a really honest conversation. Picking up at verse 27, "You have heard that it was said, 'Do not commit adultery.' But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. It has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce, but I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife, except for marital unfaithfulness, causes her to become an adulteress, and anyone who marries the divorced woman commits adultery." All right, so Jesus has just finished unpacking a little bit of God's broad heart or his intent behind the sixth commandment, do not murder. He turns his attention to the seventh commandment, do not commit adultery. And like you and I would be prone to do, that we would just be tempted to say, well, have I slept with anybody I wasn't married to? No, I'm good. I'm living up precisely. In fact, now I've got 2 check marks. I didn't kill anyone. I'm not sleeping with somebody I'm not married to. And Jesus comes along and quite uncomfortably draws God's intention much broader than this. He says, and God's heartbeat behind this, I'll maybe say this at the outset, laws often are expressed negatively. Don't do something. But the heartbeat behind it is positive. And while we'll talk about some of the negative aspects of this, we shouldn't lose sight of this. God's heart behind this is for healthy, vibrant, flourishing, sexually fulfilling marriage relationships. And you and I have to wrestle with the prohibition actually has our best interests at heart. But Jesus is about to draw the intent much wider. It's going to include what goes on kind of in our minds and in our hearts, and it's very uncomfortable, and we'll all struggle with this together. So, welcome to church. Let me give you a few, disclaimer at the outset here. I'm not going to talk about divorce at all this Sunday. I've included it in this section because it has to do with God's heart for healthy and flourishing marriages. The reason I'm not going to talk about it is, one, we don't have anywhere near enough time. But more importantly, if you've been tracking with us, you know we spent an entire Sunday on this past spring when we were walking through Mark's gospel and came to Mark chapter 10. And so instead of reiterating what I said that Sunday, I will simply say if you're curious about some of our thoughts, biblically and otherwise, on that subject, go check it out. It's on our website. The series was called Follow Me, and the sermon, I believe, was called The Upside Down Kingdom. So feel free to look that up. I'm not abdicating on it. We just taught about it here in the last year. And so we're going to sit in a place where we haven't taught for a while. Last week, I walked through the passage with 5 observations. Let me do the same this morning as a way of table setting, and then we'll get practical. Observation number 1. A simple or a specific example does not equal a narrow application. By which I mean the following. Jesus uses a very specific example, and it seems to target married men. But when it comes to the subject of lustful thoughts, we probably shouldn't limit the application to married men only. Certainly this includes unmarried men as well. And for all the women nodding their heads going, "You preach to my husband, Pastor," probably this includes married and unmarried women as well. There's something for all of us in this passage. That's observation number 1. Number 2, friends, there is a difference between a look and lingering. God has designed you with a sex drive so that when you see a good-looking individual, be it a man or a woman, your hormones, which up until that point were walking in relatively uniform single file, the one in front stops and everyone else tumbles into each other, and it literally leaves us confused and discombobulated, and we struggle to catch our breath, and we stammer to have a conversation with the person, and the sensory overload goes running through your mind, and it roughly translates as, well, hello there. And you hope that's just your internal voice. This is the look, okay? I mean this from my heart. This is not it just does not mean that your hardwiring is broken or functioning like it wasn't designed. This is the way God oriented you. Now, I'm actually going to come back to this in application as to some of the reasons why I think that is. This is not the look that Jesus is talking about. And I'm not a proficient Greek student, so I ask James good questions and I read a lot. What you need to know is in the Greek, Jesus addresses this issue with the present active participle. And this means there's two things it hints at. One is Jesus is hinting at an ongoing action with a specific purpose or intent behind it. So if I could paraphrase this, what Jesus is saying is anyone who looks and keeps on looking in order to lust after. That's the difference between a look and lingering. Just so that we're on the same page. When I was a kid, I remember like every time I feel like I'd have a look moment, I'd feel like I'd want to slap myself in the face and say, oh, no, that's bad. No, it's not. It's normal. There's a difference between look and lingering, and I'll suggest that even common sense, you and I know the difference. You know when we've transitioned from one to the other. Observation number 3. Our heart is fed by our eyes. Jesus is making this connection. Our stomach is fed by what goes in our mouth, right? What you put in here goes into here. Now, our heart in this case, we're not speaking literally, we're speaking somewhat figuratively of the center of our being. And what Jesus says is the affections of our heart, the affections and desires of our lives are shaped by what comes in through our eyes. In fact, I was thinking, I promise this is not closing song, but for those of you that were raised with a classical Sunday school upbringing, you will recall the, oh, be careful, little eyes, what? Right? Okay, some of you know this. Oh, be careful, little hands. Oh, be careful, little feet. This is like the 100% perfect song to close this morning with. We're not going to do it. But this is the point behind the song. What we take in through here has implications for what our heart starts to be shaped by. This is what Jesus is suggesting. Number 4, when Jesus says gouge it out or cut it off, he's not speaking literally. For the love of all things good, do not go looking for an ice pick or a hacksaw to apply this passage. And how do I know this is the case? By the way, the literary technique is called hyperbole, right? This is exaggeration to make a point. When somebody says, I've told you 1,000,000 times, you know the right answer isn't to look at them and go, actually, I don't think we're up to that yet. Why don't you tell me again? The point is, I've told you more times than I should have to. Why aren't you cluing in already? This is the technique. You and I know what this looks like. How do we know we're on very good interpretive grounds? Jesus does not mean this literally, and I'll suggest because it's implicit in the passage. Lust is an internal motivation. It is something that you and I understand that we can still do without both of our eyes. And without both of our hands, and if we were to reference another passage in Matthew, without both of our feet, Jesus likes to use the amputation analogy here. Lust is not something that will be solved by poking out our eyes or cutting off our hands. So Jesus is not speaking literally. That doesn't mean he's not speaking seriously. And I'll come back to this in application as well. Probably there is some radical surgery that we need, but it's not physical. It's going to come in the area of self-discipline, boundaries, and the like. Last observation. Lust is displeasing to God and damaging to relationships. This was kind of the punchline that I said, or the 5th observation last week on the subject of anger, where we were talking about, of the 2 words Jesus chooses to use, he doesn't actually talk about the outburst of anger. And it's not because that's okay, it's because that's obvious. And so he points to the internal nursing and nurturing of bitterness and resentment that's far less obvious is you guys need to understand this is still displeasing to God, and it's damaging to you and to the relationship. Jesus does the same thing with sexual sin here. He points to that which is not obvious to anyone and says you need to understand something that's displeasing to God, and it's damaging to you and to relationships around you. Now, as I already alluded to, I feel like it's just going to do a disservice to the passage if we aren't willing to walk into some very practical, if uncomfortable, conversation here this morning. So, ready or not, here we come. But pornography is just one of those pieces. It is so normative in our world today. Here's a handful of statistics on the subject. These are just ones that stood out to me. But $97 billion a year industry, that's globally, just jaw-dropping. Every second, over 28,000 are viewing. Every day, 68 million searches are typed into search engines. By the way, that accounts for roughly 25%. 1 out of 4 Google searches are pornography-based, and the average age of first-time porn exposure is 11 years old. And with permission, I'll say this was precisely our experience when our daughter was over at a friend's house. It happened. 11 years old. So for those of you parents that think you shouldn't have to have this conversation before your children are much older than they currently are, whether they're ready for it or whether you're ready for it, our culture is pushing this conversation earlier and earlier. Now, I share these statistics, and I want to be careful with this. My point is not to shock you with this. Most of us know this. I just share this to say it's so normative, we need to be able to talk about this. Now, on the subject of viewing pornography, I have yet to hear a compelling argument for defining this as anything other than the kind of lingering, intentional, lustful look that Jesus is talking about in Matthew chapter 5. I have yet to hear a persuasive argument. Most people don't try to justify pornography by going, well, I'm really just appreciating the physical form of. Most people won't do that. And it's very difficult to get around Jesus' little soundbite here in Matthew 5 and conclude that viewing this is anything other than sin. And the church's response, for the most part over the years, has kind of been a flustered sense of embarrassment on the subject. We're just like, well, you know, it's dirty, it's bad, don't do it. There, thus saith the Lord. And the reality is it's not changing anybody's behavior. Like intellectually, you and I know it's displeasing to God. We know it falls into kind of a sin category, but we actually don't really live any differently on this subject. And just statistically, 2 out of 3 men in this building with me right now struggle with this, whether excessively or sporadically, and roughly 1 out of every 9 women. That's just the statistics. So we struggle with this. Why? And I want to make a suggestion this morning. We know it's not pleasing to God, but I don't think we're convinced that it's damaging to relationships. I think if we were convinced that it was damaging to relationships, we would think, at least occasionally, about living differently. And here's the thing with pornography. Pornography promises great sex. And we go, I want that. Right? You and I go, God, I think you're holding out on me. And so we really just do what Adam and Eve did. We go, when we conclude that God is holding out on us, that we would be happier and more fulfilled with something that God has said, maybe don't do that. In our lives, we go, I'm not going to listen to you. I'm going to help myself to whatever the forbidden fruit is. Only to discover that we often wind up with more consequences than we ever thought, and it's more damaging than we ever anticipated. And the wonderful thing, don't take this soundbite out of context. The wonderful thing about pornography, pause, is that it's been so prevalent and so normative for so long that non-Jesus followers are articulating and writing about the damaging effects that this is having. I don't actually have to stand up here and go, because God said so anymore. You can find this information on non-church sites now. What is funny to me, and I'll show you 2 quotes in a minute, that just to make this point, you can watch for this in your own research or reading on the subject. Our culture has no moral foundation from which to actually call a behavior wrong. So out of one side of our culture's mouth, they have to affirm pornography, while on the other side, they're actually charting the negative effects this has. And so this is what comes out. I wanted you just to see this because I was reading, this is like a direct quote. It's part of the same paragraph from like a non-Jesus following site. Pornography use itself is not inherently a problem for intimate relationships. Now, the ellipsis points are 2 sentences just describing the difference, the definition between what they would say is, well, sporadic or recreational usage versus excessive or addicting, okay? Same paragraph. So it's not inherently a problem for intimate relationships. But in 2013, Cosmopolitan magazine surveyed 68 top sex therapists in the UK. Of them, get this, 86% felt that porn hurt their relationships, and 90% had seen an increase in relationship troubles due to porn use. Do you see the out of both corners of the mouth? This is not inherently a problem for relationships. 86 to 90% non-Jesus following sex therapists say this is hurting our relationships, and we're seeing this negatively impact the relationships that we're walking with in counseling. Same broad section. Give me the second one. Here's a direct quotation as well. Same article. I couldn't help myself. I literally laughed out loud when I read it. Infrequent porn use does not negatively affect marriages or other romantic relationships. However, the more frequently men view porn, the more insecure and unhappy their female partners tend to become. About 56% of divorce proceedings cite an obsessive interest in pornographic websites. Do you see that? Like, am I weird? Like, this is head-scratchingly bizarre that these sentences can come out of not only the same mouth, but in the same paragraph. This does not negatively affect marriages. Over half of every divorce cites pornography as a contributing factor. Excuse me? And unless I'm reading the second sentence incorrectly, there's a math equation that's offered there that says the happiness of a marriage directly corresponds to the amount of porn being viewed. This is what they actually say. And so at the very least, we would say infrequent porn use is still ensuring that the relationship is not as happy as it could be. Does this make sense? This is not a Christian perspective that I'm offering. This is a non-Jesus following perspective that says, friends, this is doing interesting, by which I don't mean good, long-term damage to relationships. And you and I have to wrestle with, not actually, and we said this at the outset of the series, the issue is not first and foremost, what do we do with what Jesus says? The question is, what do we do with Jesus? Because if you and I think that Jesus is holding out on us, we're not going to listen to what he says. But we have to ask ourselves that question. Does the preacher on the mountain know what he's talking about? Does he have our best interests at heart? If he does, then what we do with what he has to say matters. Now, because the topic of pornography and the activity of masturbation just go together, I'm going to talk about this because nobody in church circles generally does this from stage. I definitely drew the short straw when it came to preaching this particular message. I was voting for Jesse, our intern, personally. Just being honest. Jesse, hey, how do you feel about your first sermon at West Portal? All right. Quick definition. Masturbation is sex with yourself, okay? Physically stimulating yourself to the point of orgasm. Period, end of sentence. The Bible does not address this anywhere. Period, end of sentence. And so you will find, this is a disclaimer up front, not every Jesus follower, like Christian, agrees with what I'm about to tell you. I'm about to offer my opinion on the subject. I do think it is biblically shaped. But this is not in our MB confession of faith, or I'm not speaking on behalf of our church. You will find people who will make the following case. It's just a physical activity. It's just sexual release. It's no big deal. You should feel free to, it's how God wired you. You know, like knock yourself out kind of a thing. Self-gratification, okay? I disagree with this. I lean in a direction that says I think Jesus' response would be actually encouraging self-control, not self-gratification. And I'll offer 4 reasons as to why this is. You can at least track with my reasoning. The first reasoning is easily what I feel is the most significant or important point, and it's this. Virtually all masturbation involves sexual fantasy. It just does. There is a sexual movie script goes on in the head of which you or I are the adult film star and the adult film director of said production. And you can feel uncomfortable with that definition. I'm just calling it like it is. This is what is going on in the mind. And if we're going to take Jesus seriously when he says the lustful lingering, look, by the way, whether you have eyes or not to see it or are thinking about it is really falling short of God's intent. I have a hard time putting these two, the activity and the viewing issue, together. Now, for those that think it's just a physical activity, there's no big deal, you're just living into kind of the way you're wired, it's not here or there as far as sin goes. And I heard a speaker actually say this isn't my example, but he said, if that's true, you and I ought to be able to pray and masturbate at the same time. Yeah, feel free to chuckle. It's a weird image. And the answer is you and I know it doesn't work that way because physical stimulation needs mental stimulation to go along with it. And I will suggest to you, this is why I keep coming back to this particular piece. Because the activity is driven by sexual fantasy up here, and because Jesus is really clear on the subject of what goes on up here, I find myself thinking that I think his encouragement would be self-control, not self-gratification. Here's a handful of other reasons, but that's the most important one. Do you know that almost universally, people report that post-masturbation is not followed by a euphoric afterglow, like between two committed partners. What follows is a sense of guilt and shame. And this is not limited to Jesus' followers. Last week I was saying, pain is God's megaphone in our life. Like there are those twinges in conscience that lets us know when we are not rightly related to other people and when we are not rightly related to God. I will suggest to you this is God's way of kind of doing this. Just saying, maybe that's not as helpful or as neutral an activity as you think. Reason number 3, and this comes out of the equation we were talking about earlier, and this is not a Christian-based equation. The happier the relationship is based on the less porn that is viewed. And it's because this kind of sexual fantasy creates impossible competition for your spouse. By the way, present or future. This is kind of the nature of sexual fantasy. You're either cheating on the one you are married with or with one that you hope to be married to one day. Just to be clear with that kind of a thing. This is the nature of fantasy. And fantasy in and of itself is not wrong. It just fosters a healthy imagination. But the nature of fantasy is that you and I are stars in our own mental performances. So if I want to put my head on my pillow at night and have like a rock star fantasy, I put like the electric guitar on and I walk out onto a stage in front of 50,000 people and I plant my feet and I don't play a wrong note. This is the nature of fantasy. It's not untrue when it comes to sexual fantasy. We are the best lovers and the most versatile lovers and the most open lovers, and the people that are willing partners are completely subservient and willing and to your every whim and wish. It creates expectations that you and I cannot live up to and that no spouse could ever live up to. And non-Christian writers are pointing out precisely the correlation between these two things. Which brings me to kind of the last observation on this subject. And I will address this. I think this is worth talking about. The question sometimes comes up, but what if I'm fantasizing about my spouse? Okay, we'll acknowledge there's a gray area here. Let me suggest why I still think the best answer is self-control. And I'm borrowing here from he's pastor and presenter and author of if you've ever gone through Laugh Your Way to a Better Marriage as a seminar, Mark Gungor. I'm borrowing from his material because I think he's brilliantly insightful on this subject. Here's what he would say. And I'm speaking just for a minute from a male and a heterosexual orientation. If you're wired in any way differently, the point that I'm about to make is not different. You just have to contextualize for yourself. He would say this: when your sex drive kicks in, this is God's hardwiring telling you, be nice to the girl, be nice to the girl, be nice to the girl. This is the nature of the physical drives that God gives us. It's designed to motivate us. If you and I are hungry, it motivates us to get off the couch and go open the fridge. If we lived thousands of years ago, it would motivate us to get out of the cave and go hunting. If you are cold or shivering, it motivates us to look for shelter or put on an extra layer of clothes. Your sex drive is no different. It is God's motivation to send you to love the other person. You want to watch guys who have this figured out? I will show you guys who help wash dishes around their house or fold laundry. These are guys who occasionally bring flowers home, who go for walks with their wife, who go shopping with their wife. Why? Because they like shopping? No, because they like sex. I'm just calling it like it is. But they have learned that loving the person also then tends to have love reciprocated. It's a wonderful thing. And what Mark draws out, and this is the point of masturbation, he says, masturbation disconnects the reward from the behavior it's designed to motivate you towards. I don't have to be nice to the girl. I don't have to romance my spouse. I can just go love myself. And I promise you, the more you do this, the less happy you are in your marriage relationship. Why? Because you've circumvented the natural wiring that is supposed to motivate you. And it's kind of the sad thing about this. We are raising, in case you're curious, we're planning a 5-week series on biblical sexuality that will address kind of all sorts of issues and topics next year. So we won't have time to talk about the breadth of this kind of a thing. Come back and join us, at the end of February. It disconnects the desire that is intended to motivate us. And so what's happening is love that should move us. Like, we're awkward around people we are romantically attracted to. We struggle to have good conversations or to be coherent. It's intimidating to make that first phone call to ask somebody out on a date. What drives us towards this? It's precisely this kind of a thing. We are raising a generation, and this is being written about, that is preferring and choosing sexual fantasy over real relationships because it's easier. And you and I need to start asking questions of what do we really want? What do we want long term? And who are we becoming by the kind of behavior that we engage with or kind of what we take in through our eyes? Anyway, let's move to application here this morning. 3 thoughts. And I want to start here because church is traditionally the only soundbite people have heard is sex is bad. Not true. Sex is good. Sex is a God-given gift. God is not a prude on the subject of sex. He's its architect and designer. He didn't have to make it pleasurable. He did. He could have made us asexual beings that didn't need each other. He didn't do that. He made it as a good gift. What I want to say is this, but the gift turns out to be so powerful that it needs protecting in order for it to do what it's designed to do. It is the most powerful bonding and connecting activity and behavior that can happen between 2 people. But if you take it out of that context, and the more you spread it around, a little bit like tape, the more you use it, the less sticky and it becomes. This, and again, I do not need to point you to Christian statistics on this part. Non-Christians are writing, and it's data now. The more sexual partners you have before you're married, the less likely your marriage is to last, and the less happy you are to be in your marriage. The more porn you engage with, the less happy your relationship is. It is a good gift, but it is so powerful, it demands a respected and a specific context for it to do what it needs to do, for it to be appreciated for the good gift it is. But you need to hear me say that. It is a good gift. It's not dirty. It's not bad. It just needs the proper context. Second, Jesus is not talking about literal mutilation, but that doesn't mean that he's not talking about a radical form of surgery. This is where we come back to that, oh, be careful, little eyes, what you see, and little hand, what you do. And if we went to Matthew 18, be careful, little feet, where you go. When Jesus says, gouge out your eye, he's just saying in a really emphatic way, don't look. Shut off your computer. Like, walk away from your friend's iPhone or whatever. Choose to behave as if you had gouged your eye out. When he says cut off your hand, he says don't do it. Stop engaging in behavior or activity that's taking you down that kind of a lustful, lingering thought pattern. When he says cut off your feet in another passage, don't go. And I think that's as appropriate in a virtual world as it is in like a physical world. Don't go frequent places that take you into that kind of a temptation spiral. And he puts the onus on us, by the way, to self-monitor. If your eye causes you to sin, if your hand causes you to sin, pay attention to your own triggers. Know your own temptation cycle and be willing to put up the kind of radical guardrails, self-discipline boundaries that are needed in order for you to walk with integrity and with purity on this subject, if it matters to you. Like, and you have to choose what you want to do with Jesus. I actually really feel like I don't care what you think about what I have to say. This is your call. I'm just convinced that when you and I don't live the way of Jesus, inevitably we regret it. And I'm just trying to make sure that you understand that this morning. Make the decision that you need to make on this kind of a subject. Lastly, don't be too embarrassed to ask for help. This is the nature of sexual purity, and in particular sexual impurity, is that it is fueled by first an overwhelming sense of shame. Oh, I'm so bad, I'm so dirty, I'm so what. And then it spirals because it's accompanied by a sense of isolation, and I'm the only person that struggles with this. And that sense of shame and guilt drives and motivates, and it becomes this addictive cycle and behavior. I've been debating all week whether or not to do this. I'm going to do it. I don't care if you want to answer honestly or not. But with no details, I don't care the level of your struggle or to what degree this has to happen. But if I asked you honestly, how many of you would say, you know what, the reality is I struggle with sexual purity? Put your hand up. I struggle with sexual purity. Most of us do. I'll suggest a good portion that didn't put up their hands are not sure what to do with that question in church. That's okay. This is the reality. These are the issues we struggle with and the conversations we tend not to want to have. And most of us will not track our own way out of this. We actually need the help and the care of those alongside us to help us do this. But it starts with being honest. Here's a handful of ideas or options for you. You can do your own research on this and kind of whatever else. But Covenant Eyes, I don't know if you're familiar with this. This is a downloadable computer software. It links your computer with an accountability partner so that every time you visit an inappropriate place, it sends the accountability partner an email. That's a deterrent. It is. If you know that what you're doing in the basement is going right away to a friend, and you've had to set this up, obviously, it starts to do what it's designed to do. This is designed for friends to walk alongside friends, or spouses to support each other, or parents to walk with kids. This is the point of it. Conquer series. We offered this a couple of years ago. Just education about like porn and its addictive power, and then accountability groups that come alongside with this as a support mechanism. We don't offer this every year. We offer this basically on an interest basis. If for any reason you're curious about this, for at least this Sunday only, you can scan the QR code. You'll see a button in there saying Conquer Series. If that interests you, indicate your interest that way. If there's enough people that are interested, we'll put a group together in the new year for this. Freedom sessions. We've been honest about this in a handful of places. It's closed for this year because we're already several weeks in. But it's a very honest conversation about different areas that we struggle with and different ways that we cope with shame and with pain and with guilt and different things in our lives, of which sexual purity is one. The group I am sitting with consistently on a weekly basis is having some very honest and very uncomfortable conversations, and it's really healthy. You feel free to talk to any one of us who are a part of that. We'll tell you how much fun and not fun we're having, but we'll also tell you whether we think it's valuable. And you can watch for this because I expect we'll run this again next year. And as I was saying before, God's intent for this goes way beyond the don't do. It's not just don't commit adultery. And I'll suggest it goes beyond the don't linger lustfully. God's heartbeat is for thriving, healthy, happy, sexually satisfying marriage relationships. If yours would benefit from some enrichment, Alpha Marriage Course, watch for that. We offer this usually every 2 to 3 years. We did this just last year, I want to say. And so because of that, it's not on our docket for this year. But if that's something that you would be interested in, there are other churches that are running it in the meantime. We'd be happy to connect you or point you in that direction. The other is there's a marriage enrichment weekend coming up here, in our city, November 4th to 6th. It's called Hope Encounters. There's a notice and information on the bulletin board just outside our church office that if you want to check that out, feel free to do. Let me leave you with the following thought or idea, and thanks for your time and patience this morning. Was listening to, I want to say it was New York pastor John Tyson. lust is the twisting of, it is the distortion of a God-given good and healthy desire for intimacy and for beauty. And he said the problem with pornography actually turns out to be not that it shows too much. The problem is it doesn't show enough. He said pornography, as graphic as it is, shows a physical act, but it shows a physical act completely devoid of emotion, of love, of intimacy, of relationship, of commitment, and of responsibility. You and I need to listen to the longing in our heart and not be satisfied for anything less than satisfying the deep longing that is sitting in there. Like I said, I Survived Sex Sunday t-shirts will be available on your way out the door. Let's pray. Jesus, thank you for your honest words with us. Thank you that you care. That you care about the way we live, and it's because you have our best interests at heart. That you don't want to see us hurt, and you don't want to see us contributing to the brokenness in our own lives and the brokenness in the relationships around us and the brokenness in our marriages. That you offer hard-hitting, invasive words. You're not a killjoy. You're not here to rob us of fun. You want us to enjoy life to the full, but you've designed us certain ways to experience that. And so I guess my prayer this morning is that your Holy Spirit would prompt and prod and help us do the kind of radical, honest assessment of where we're at and to what level we struggle with an overarching issue like sexual purity. And we ask that your gospel, that your good news would start to give us the kind of kingdom behavior blood transfusion that only you can offer, that you would begin to change the affections of our heart, the longings in our lives, that we would listen to the deeper longings. And to that end, would be willing to put up some radical boundaries, that we would guard our eyes from what they're looking at, and we would guard our hands from what they're doing, and our feet from the places that they're tempted to go. And I think I also want to just ask that you would give us humility and grace to walk openly and transparently as a faith community on this kind of a sensitive subject. And we'll acknowledge that it's uncomfortable and it's personal and it's gritty and it's real. And your gospel has come to make a difference in the gritty, real, everyday issues that we battle and struggle with. So may we be transparent increasingly with these kind of conversations so that we can walk well and walk alongside others toward the kind of freedom and healing and wholeness that you've called us. Thank you for your forgiveness and your grace that covers the brokenness and the shame and the guilt that we feel. Thank you for your great love for us. This we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.